Okay, so welcome. Welcome to Council-led Housing Forum. This is the second time that we're running Council-led Housing Forum through a webinar format. So some of you may be familiar from last year and earlier in the year, in fact, we were running live sessions. Today we are obviously dependent on our internet connection as of course I use. So hopefully it'll all run really smoothly and there won't be any drops in the internet. But if there is, please be patient with us and we'll be back up online as soon as we can. The forum was set up to provide support to the London boroughs, the companies and also ALMOs who are delivering new council homes for Londoners. And these sessions are aimed at practitioners. Today's session in particular is aimed at those who are less familiar with the delivering of development, either because you're new into the teams or perhaps because you're in a support function and so you're not part of the day-to-day management of development. So this particular session, project inception and planning, we are following on from last month's session, which was initial analysis and feasibility. So the second one in our mini series that's taking us through the 4 stages of development. So I'm Visika Sri Chandrasekhara. Next slide. And I work for Future of London. Future of London, for those of you who know us, we're a network for the built environment, and we provide support to the boroughs, particularly around knowledge, leadership and networking. And none of this would be possible without our sponsors. So I want to give a quick mention to the support we receive from the Greater London Authority, the GLA, from Redloft, from Potter RIBA, and also from BPTW. And we do have representatives from the last 3 on our panel later, so you get a chance to actually ask some questions as well. So, moving on to our agenda. In the introduction, that's what we're just doing at the moment. And when we've done the introduction, I do a little piece of housekeeping as well. And then we'll move to the main presentation. So it's very much this is an agenda in 2 parts. So that's the first part, and then you actually get a break. So the break will be a 10-minute break, and that's your chance to get up, move around a bit, get a cup of tea, maybe a biscuit, whatever. And then we're into the second part. We'll start very promptly. I'll make sure that you know exactly what time we're coming back. And we'll have a case study that will illustrate the presentation from the first part. And then we'll go straight into a Q&A session where you can ask questions both about the presentations that you've heard, but also if you've got questions that relate to the presentation that you've heard, but are actually about your own ones, you can ask those questions too. And that second half is a Chatham House session. So we're not recording. We are recording the first half, but we're not recording the second half. Okay, so that's our agenda, and I'm going to move on and do a bit of housekeeping now. So as I've just mentioned, we are recording the first half of the webinar, so that's up until the end of the first presentation, and that means you'll be able to watch that again by going to the Future of London YouTube channel. And you can also already see on that channel the first session we did on initial analysis and feasibility. During the session, you can start submitting questions throughout, and you can do that using the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and I'll show you that in a minute. If you lose connection, as I say, we're all dependent on our internet now, just go back to your invitation and re-click the link, which will let you back into the webinar. Okay, and finally, when you do leave the webinar at the end, you will be directed to a feedback form, and we'd really appreciate you giving us some feedback on the session. We've quite recent, this is our second webinar, and we're really keen to get feedback, both about format and also about content. So please do give us that feedback at the end. Okay. So let's just move on. We've got the Q&A. Here's, as I mentioned, you can use this at any point, and you just click on the Q&A, bring it up and give us your question. Can you please let us know who you are? So if you put your name and just tell us which organisation you're from, that'd be really helpful. And also, if you want to direct the question to a specific person, let us know that too. Okay, that's really helpful. So don't forget, at any point, you can help us a bit with this morning's session by doing a poll. So in a minute, I'm going to launch a poll with some questions which relate to you and your work. What I'd like you to do is just give us the best fit answer. So because it's multiple choice, it might not be one that's quite right, but just give us the best fit answer and answer as many as you can. Okay, so I'm now going to launch the poll. That should pop up on your screen. It is a pop-up. You should be able to see that and be able to start answering questions. Okay, I'm going to bring the poll to a close. Thanks everybody for taking part. It's really good. I've just seen actually we're clicking up a few more answers, so you don't want to miss anybody or miss any answers. Yes. Okay, we're looking good now. I think most of you have had a chance. We're about 90% or more of us complete. Going to do a countdown. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, I'm going to switch the polls off, and we're going to come back to the poll questions during the presentation. So bear with us, we'll be coming back to those and letting you know what the answers in the room are. Thank you. Okay, so let's move to our first presentation. So our first presentation, which will cover the topic, project inception and planning. Danny Kay will be joining us. You'll see Danny come up in a moment on your screens. Danny is Managing Director at Sheridan Development Management and has worked with Future of London and our Council-led Housing Forum for quite a long time. So, but Danny is a surveyor, qualified surveyor, and has too many years of experience for me to mention, but he's going to bring all of that expertise into this presentation. Danny, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining today. Today is very much around the planning process and all the activities associated with being a development manager during the planning process. Now, that's not just about securing a planning consent. There's running the project at the same time. Today's session is about that focus, the DM1, and it's a follow-on from the first session, initial analysis and feasibility. If you like, the first session was about securing a business plan, securing a budget, identifying a business plan, and opening the can, as it were, in terms of the due diligence activities and investigations that you need to do to identify risks for a specific project. Now, in this stage, we're going to actually go further than just open the can. We're going to open a number of cans and go to the bottom of the can, as it were, and forgive the cliche. So, the planning process. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the details of the English planning system. But essentially, you need to take into account the policy position in terms of national government policy, regional policy, which in the case of London will be the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority's London Plan, and your local plan for your local authority. Of course, local plans do differ. They reflect the different geographies, different typologies, different densities. Local plan could focus on higher density, for example, in inner London, and in outer London boroughs, for example, Barnet or Havering or Enfield, perhaps higher density but lower density in some areas. I'm not going to focus very much on the challenges around COVID-19. We might pick those up in the Q&A at the end, but obviously you're all aware of it, and many local authorities are doing a grand job in terms of dealing with planning committees and preparation for planning committees virtually and online. And many teams are trying to do exactly the same thing by having pre-app meetings with the planning officers online, and indeed undertaking local consultation, which is very, very important through online fora. For many of this stage, the project inception planning is the most exciting part of the planning process. You are now going to create your building, your product, your place, your environment, your objective. Actually, nothing can be built without your planning consent. And it's an exciting and creative part of the process involving a whole range of professional disciplines, including architecture and design. Very important, I would say, is to just reflect on what was approved at your business plan stage by your committee or by your director in terms of the budget, and use that and create a development brief. We'll come on to the details of development brief in a little bit in the next slide. Just take stock on the professional disciplines and technical work that's required. You've already set that out in the first stage, DM1, and work up a detailed plan and sequence and program. Now, there will be variations. You'll need to be flexible and adaptable to that program and sequence, but actually it's a starting point. One of the dangers with the planning process is that it can meander, it can become tangential. So having that focus on timescale is just as important at this stage of the development process. You're selecting and appointing your professional team, but also lining up internal stakeholders. And those internal stakeholders are members of your housing management team, lettings, asset management, even, and you can refer to them as stakeholders, even your building control teams. And the first thing is to convene an inception meeting with the reference point of your development brief. So, next slide, please. What's in your development brief? Well, actually, we've covered this in the first session, but it's all about the why, the what, how, when, and so on. The number of homes that you were targeting, the type of homes, the tenures, the houses, the flat, the mix, 1 bed, 2 person, 3 bed, 5 person, and so on and so forth, the unit sizes, tenures, rent levels, affordability, your financial targets, your spatial design standards. You'll have internal documents about best practice or actual defined employers' requirements about what you want in terms of specification, overall budget and financial performance, and also, again, importantly, your approach to stakeholder consultation. And then finally, the very important reference point on program and milestones, be it 3 months to the point of planning application, 6 months to the point of planning application, allowing 6 months for securing planning. It's all about making things clear to your professional team and to your colleagues and your stakeholders, and also setting out those expectations. Now, development brief. Visica, what came out in the poll in terms of this question? How many people are adopting a development brief in their project management approach, development management approach?
Yeah, Danny, the results of that poll question, our audience actually They're definitely people who write development briefs. 82% said yes, that's part of their process.
Excellent.
And I appreciate, yeah, it's a high, which is good.
Excellent. Well, well done, everybody. I would say so. That I think that's exactly the right thing to do. It's very important to have that reference point. I'm sure we might come back to this in a Q&A later. Let's move on to the next slide. So let's just remind ourselves about the planning risk, but also not just the planning risk, the development risks. We are in a very volatile economic time, and it's entirely possible, and the predictions are that property values, sales values, rental values will go down. Conversely, it's entirely possible that construction costs could go up as a result of supply chain pressures and so on and so forth. So you've got to remember these things. Remember that your financial appraisal and your overall budget may be a moving feast, as it were, a dynamic entity. So you need to continue to use your appraisal to check to see that the scheme is working towards your financial targets as agreed, as approved, and continue to do those sensitivities. There'll be macroeconomic things you want to take into account, and certainly your finance teams will be thinking about, which may have an impact on inflation, which again is an important feature of your appraisal model, interest rates, and government policy. Hopefully, and I do say this very hopefully, we won't find that there's a back to the future, as it were, and we go back to 2015 when the government, 2015-16, when the government introduced a -1% on the rents, which actually very much impacted upon an individual project business plans. Why would government do this? Well, they want to save money and to save the housing benefit bill, but actually, as we know, that potentially severely affects business plans for development. Legal and title, so important. Many of the schemes that you're working on, if not most of the schemes you're working on, will be on existing land and existing estates where there are specific things to take into account. Many of those estates have had right to buy. There may be leaseholder rights. There may be pram sheds which are owned, which you'll need to purchase out and redevelop on. There'll be a whole bunch of title issues, as always in development projects. A measured survey is so important, a very important starting point to make sure that you know literally the lie of the land and the extent of the land. That will inform your architectural designs, it will inform your costs, it will inform your approach to the design, and most particularly the approach of your architect, of your engineering team, of your technical teams. Adopted highways, transport and access, very much adopted highways. Many of these projects that you'll be working on, there probably will be a requirement to de-adopt some land which you'll be building on. The adoption process can take quite some time. Services, position, capacity, disconnections and connections, all of these add up as costs. Soil quality, contamination, remediation. You might be knocking down garages with asbestos roofs, and that will add a little bit more onto the actual construction costs. Archaeology, well, London's got an incredibly rich history going back 2,000 years. It has been known to come across Anglo-Saxon remains, Roman coins, and so on. Archaeology, if these things are found, which again is normally a desktop survey will suffice, but if something is found, add another 2 years to your program. Next slide, please. Unexploded ordnance, flood risk. There's a whole network, in fact, of brooks, of rivers, in addition to the obvious River Thames, throughout London. And actually, there genuinely are flood risk issues within London. Protected trees and wildlife. There might be a tree preservation order, which probably mean you won't be able to knock the tree down. Not if you may not even want to knock the tree down, or daylight and sunlight and shadow. These are really, really important points, not just affecting the new building about the quality of daylight and sunlight within the scheme, but also the impact on adjacent buildings and adjacent properties. not forgetting that actually rights of light, albeit there's similarities, is a different test. It's a property test, not a planning test. And actually, even if you satisfy the daylight and sunlight test, rights of light might fail. So don't forget that. So when you're actually engaging your consultants to do daylight and sunlight, you'll want them in certain circumstances to do a rights of light test. And then we move on to noise, glare, refuse, amenity spaces, consultation and engagement. Again, so critical and central to a successful planning process. And then a final development planning risk is momentum. I'm not talking about the political movement. Momentum as in keeping pace. It can often be the case, so often in the planning process, that because of delays or because of issues that you need to address, that actually you lose that momentum in the project team. You need to be very careful not to lose that momentum and keep the pace, keep the right pace. Make sure you do things as best you can in the right sequence as well. Let's move on to the next slide. And thinking about the roles and responsibilities, this typically will be your professional team during the planning process. I think it's fairly self-explanatory, not forgetting the role of the principal designer in terms of health and safety, but also, as I've just said previously, the surveys, the boundary survey, the site survey, the lie of the land, and so importantly, services, capacity and positions, to make sure you do those checks. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Selecting your team. We could do a whole session, a 3-hour, 4-hour, a day session on procurement processes and selecting your team and frameworks. I would just say that it makes sense to speak to your colleagues, speak and work with your employer's agent, because they'll have a very good idea about what the procurement rules are, and adopt good practice. And don't forget actually that once, obviously you need to follow the right processes in terms of it, procurement rules, financial regulations, value for money, tendering, and so on. But actually you want your professional team to be competent, to have the right kind of quality, passion, energy, commitment, and show and demonstrate understanding of the brief. And of course, you need to keep an eye on, as part of your role, central part of your role, on the budget in terms of fees and prices. And not forgetting formalizing in a form of appointment. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So this would be the typical sub-stages of your project. In short, you'll be looking at an inception meeting. You'll be doing due diligence, and this due diligence is so often better to do before you've really kick-started and you've said to your architect and engineers, actually start designing. The due diligence informs the design. Now, sometimes there will be an ebb and flow in this process, but actually many consultants recognize the need to actually do those due diligence checks. You've opened the can in the first stage, you're now going much further potentially with intrusive site investigations. You might indeed also be, during this process, be securing vacant possession and buying out pram sheds and so on and so forth. There's a whole range of things, parallel activities. So inception, due diligence, the pre-app process, this is now sort of an accepted process, that prior to your planning application submission itself, there'll be an earlier stage where you would have actually met with the planning team. You might have a planning performance agreement with the planning department. You've met with the planning team, and you get feedback on your initial designs and your initial work. Very valuable part of the process, the pre-app process. Local consultation. You're pulling together your planning application. Eventually, it will get validated once you've submitted. And then there's the post-planning negotiation, clarifications process, meetings with the planning team, jointly with your architect and other professional team members, planning committee, and then post-planning. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So there's some key things to think about and reference points. Again, the due diligence, the investigations, the being clear on constraints is vital. Vital to understand. You don't want it to interrupt the process later. You don't want to find that down the line you have a design which everyone thinks is amazing and is accepted and satisfies all the tests, but actually that you discover that there is a major sewer that is too costly to divert, and means that in fact your design needs to be pushed back and changes the whole concept. You obviously need to refer back to your original design work and some early design concepts, but the design will be evolving. So important because it works. It's a good reference point to follow the Royal Institute of British Architects, RIBA, stages of the design process. It's an excellent reference point for everyone throughout, and in terms of staging and phasing, also the expenditure during the planning process. Don't forget the regular financial testing in terms of your development appraisal, the pre-app process, liaison with external stakeholders, the local community, ward councillors, public consultation, local societies, a civic society. Don't forget your internal stakeholders, your colleagues down the corridor, that actually has such a valuable contribution to the reality about whether a design works in housing management, asset management terms. So don't forget to pop down the corridor. Of course, it's not so easy these days, but hopefully we'll get back to normal, the new normal, where in fact that liaison with your colleagues in other departments can become just that much easier. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned national planning policy, regional planning policy, local planning policy. There are a whole range of documents, potentially 50 documents that you need to refer to across the piece, which could be specialist guidance on areas if your scheme's in a conservation area, or if it's listed, or if they're locally listed buildings adjacent, if there's the specific guidance on design and distances between buildings, and there are policies which differ between authorities. But these, just capturing all the planning policy reference points, these are the key planning issues and things, from land use to change of use. It could be because your scheme might actually be on open space, so actually for it to become residential is effectively a change of use. External appearance, self-explanatory really, you know, what does it look like? Is it going to be appreciated as a contribution to the built environment? Density, local amenity, transport, parking, some very, very important issues there. A very big challenge because land is scarce and parking takes up quite a bit of space in a if you think about the ground floor plane of a scheme. Is it livable? Can you service it? Can emergency vehicles enter into the site, into the scheme satisfactorily, including fire, you know, from a fire risk perspective? Energy, sustainability, and noise. There's a complex matrix of tenure mix, financial viability, and if you're doing market sale, there'll be community infrastructure levy, SIL implications in your financial appraisal. Let's just take stock. Visica, poll question number 2. What came up as the biggest planning risk by our viewers, our audience?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I'm just going to get that up on my screen. And I'll just let everyone know the question, because I understand that some people couldn't see the questions if they had a pop-up blocker.
Right.
Although we did get a good response from the audience. So the question was, what do you consider to be the biggest planning risks for your projects? And we gave people 4 options, so they weren't, there's bound to be things that maybe didn't quite fit for everybody. I'll just run through them. So the first one was external appearance and scale. That was high, that was 32% of our audience. The second one was daylight, sunlight and shadow. That was a bit lower, that was 23%. The third one was land use and change of use. And this was again, this was the top one along with the external appearance, and that was also 32%. So that was land use and change of use. And our fourth option for our audience was transport, parking and access. And that was the one that came lowest in terms of our audience and their planning risk for profile for their projects. And that was just 14%.
Oh, okay. Good. Well, that's very interesting. Thanks very much. I would have expected transport, parking and access just to be a little bit higher, but that's interesting. I'm sure perhaps we can touch upon that in the Q&A. But external appearance and scale, yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. Roughly a third. And land use and change of use, a third. And daylight and sunlight and shadow, well, that does inform external appearance and scale as well. Okay, that's very interesting. Almost what I was expecting, but perhaps I was expecting a bit more on transport, parking, and access. But let's move on to the next slide, if we may. These are the ones. These are my hot topics in terms of all the projects that I've been involved with in the planning process and so on. Height and bulk, getting that balance right. External finish, I think this chimes with the poll. The rhythm of the materials, the rhythm, the windows, the roofs, parking and refuse, daylight, sunlight and shadow. Don't forget rights of light as well, which is not a planning issue. Unit mix, tenure, affordability of affordable housing. That can be an issue even with local authority led projects. Local impact in terms of loss of open space and stopping up of highway land. Not necessarily because it's a controversial issue, the stopping up of highway land. It takes an awfully long time. There is a very specific and rigorous process and time-related process you need to go through, and actually you want to build that into your process very clearly to make sure that your project isn't delayed post-planning. So let's move on to the next slide. So here's some key points to remember, consider. I've already mentioned and emphasised the importance of local consultation and engagement, bringing the community with you. Keeping discipline on the finances and the programme. It's so easy to just to lose track of that when you're juggling a whole bunch of meetings. You've got to get some information into the pre-app meeting. There's a requirement to make a change to the design, and that requires the architect to do a whole bunch more work. And just let's not forget that then in the first session we talked about sort of perhaps spending £25,000, £30,000, £50,000 on that initial investigative work. You're moving into a much bigger range here of expenditure to secure planning and do all that due diligence activity. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of pounds potentially, depending on the size of the scheme. So actually, Visika, let's just see what's come out with the poll results on the third poll question. Shall I hand over to you on that, and so you can just reiterate what those questions are?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll just reiterate the question. So the question was, what is the average project budget for your scheme to the end of the planning stage? And we gave people 5 options. So I'm just going to run through those options and tell you what our audience, what their position is. So budget up to 250k, 18% of this morning's audience. 250k to 500, 14%, which is the lowest score along with the next but one. 500 to 750k, 18%. Above 750, 14%. But by far the biggest winner in the poll was our last option, which was don't know. That was 36%. So, you know, a good third of our audience this morning.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, that's very interesting. It shows that there's a range of schemes, and even £250,000 is a lot of money for your department, for your team, for your project. Imagine if 10 projects where you're through the planning process, you're spending £250,000 and you don't get planning, you're looking at departmental abortive cost of £2.5 million. So it just tells you how important this process is. There's a range there. The 36% don't know. Well, that's interesting. Perhaps we can unpack that a little bit in the Q&A. But I think it's just so important to know and to keep a hold as part of your development management role on the finances, on the budget, and to, if you're working with a colleague who might be leading the process, is to learn from the colleague about how they manage that budget and the process. So just to reflect on other things to remember, be wary of drift and fatigue. The planning process can be extended. It is complex, and potentially numerous things crop up that in terms of resistance or objections and legitimate concerns about the scheme, and then suddenly you're spending another 8 weeks on making revisions, and you can lose track of that. So keep on the program, avoid drift. Always sound out your colleagues and internal stakeholders. Is it buildable? Ultimately, you need the inputs of your quantity surveyor, your engineer, your employer's agent. I also am a big fan of procuring for construction with your contractor partner, your builder, as early as possible, and actually having your contractor as part of the project team. I know there's challenges in procurement on that, but I think it can be an extremely helpful and valuable process to ensure that what is designed is buildable. And let's not forget, actually, and the subject of modern methods of construction, off-site manufacturing, has been very much a feature of COVID-19 discussions about how can we make the construction process more efficient and more effective. And there are a lot of advantages to modern methods of construction, but one of the most important points that if you are considering your architectural design, your design team, your directors are saying, let's see whether it can work here, you need to actually build that thinking in, that discipline in from day one, from the start of the planning process, because the variables and the variations associated with articulation, with design, with heights, with variations in the planning process potentially could make modern methods of construction an unviable construction route. So you want to actually build that thinking in early days. Will your building stand the test of time in terms of operational expenditure? And don't forget, actually, you may or may not have a specialist planning colleague in your team, or a planning consultant, or someone who's charged with responsibility to making sure that all the planning documents hold together. But actually part of your role as a development manager is to make sure that they do hang together, and there are cross-referencing, which is consistent in terms of the tenure mix, in terms of child yield calculations, transport assessment calculations, all of which based upon some key baseline assumptions in terms of your scheme. Scrutinise the recommendation report and the draft conditions. The draft conditions can often have wording in there which you might not realise now potentially adds another 2 months to your programme, which means you can't do certain things in terms of demolition. So be careful about those conditions and make sure that you use the skills, knowledge and experience of your employer's agent. Next slide, please. Affordable housing, and if assuming many of your schemes are 100% affordable housing, will be good news stories. But there will be many people that don't like change. This is not a criticism, they just fear change, they fear the impact on their local community. Politics can come into play. A local councillor might have been approached by a range of people saying that they don't think it's an appropriate scheme, it's too high, there's too big an impact. Be wary that actually part of your role as that letter goes into your comes in from the councillor, you'll need to respond within 10 days, 15 days, 20 days and so on, that actually you'll need to be ready for that kind of query and the concerns about local impact. There's always a test. Would I live there? That's always a good test to ask yourself and your team, that does the scheme work? Do you think it is livable? Maxing out on density is not always the right thing to do. It can be add to a different threshold of cost. I'm sure we can touch upon this in the Q&A later, but there are tipping points in construction. As soon as you reach 11 stories, 12 stories, you potentially move into a new tipping point in terms of additional structural requirements which add to the marginal cost per metre squared, but actually your income's not going up in terms of if you've got 100% affordable rent or 100% London affordable rent, your grant rate might be fixed, your contribution in terms of subsidy might be fixed as well. Consistently throughout the processes, challenge your team and ask questions. And don't forget there are other non-planning activities to carry out in terms of the appraisal, the programme, internal consultation, stakeholder relationships as part of the planning process and as generally as part of the general process. Next slide, please. The planning committee. Even at the planning committee, everything's going well. You're happy, you know, there's a great sense of accomplishment that the planning officer has firmly recommended that your great scheme is up for a recommendation and approval. But actually, even though the planning officer might be recommending the project, it is not uncommon for schemes to be deferred on the night because there is a political issue or there's a councillor who feels like is concerned about certain aspects of the scheme, or if there is a processing issue which actually perhaps potentially can unravel matters. So making sure that the process is correct, establish the mood on the night. If there are 11th hour issues, perhaps things that you can address, actually, they're all about the internal design, just to satisfy and to make sure that there's no risk on the night. Prepare, and then be clear about who's going to speak at the committee, and mobilise support. If there are genuinely people that are supportive of the project, there's no reason why you can't ask them if they're prepared to and willing to say, well, would you mind confirming your support? So we're nearly there. Final, next slide, please. So you've gone to planning committee. It's been approved unanimously. Of course it will be. It's a wonderful scheme. You've got a professional team and you've followed the right processes and you've worked with your colleagues. You've done the stakeholder consultation. Everyone's knackered. Yeah, I'm afraid you've got to keep going because actually you're likely to have a Section 106 agreement, a legal agreement, which will capture certain planning contributions. It could be off-site works. If so, You're going to have a legal agreement called a 278 agreement. You're going to want to make sure that you understand the heads of terms of a potential highways agreement. I've already mentioned the stopping up process, and you'll be thinking about the tendering process for your contractor if you haven't already selected one. You'll be thinking about the design team, novation strategy, should you, shouldn't you, and so on. Of course, you want to celebrate success of that planning committee, but don't lose momentum. So we are now coming towards the final slide. So we can move on to the slide, please. I have to apologise. This is my sketch work and handiwork here. As a mere surveyor, I'm not an architect, of course, as you can see. But actually, it's meant to just indicate, hopefully you can appreciate from this, that where you might start off in the planning process, and let's say that is delineated by the orange lines, the orange box, points 1, 2, 3, and 4, about optimizing scale and density and so on, because of all the planning issues in terms of proximity, daylight, sunlight, certain requirements in terms of angles, moving away from sewers at point 4, so you're not building over sewers because they're too costly, and so on. So you start off, you might be starting off with the orange rectangle, 1, 2, 3, and 4. You end up with the green, which is the ground first, second, and third, step back at third, and step back at fourth. That may be viable. It has to be viable for your project. But just to give you a sense of that, actually, the planning process will shape your scheme. You continually need to think about buildability and affordability for the project. Don't forget about your efficiency ratios as well. We mentioned that in the last session about net to gross efficiency construction ratios and build to floor ratios, but also the completed building ratios in terms of how much it will cost to manage and maintain, and how much that will eat into your income stream, and that affects your financial performance of the project. So at that point, I'm going to, I've realized that actually that there is one final poll that we haven't addressed. So Visika, the final poll question: what do you consider to be the biggest challenge of the planning process? Do you want to just talk about the different options people had and how that came out?
Yeah, thanks, Danny. I think this is interesting, really interesting. And obviously people's experience will vary quite considerably. So as you say, the question was, what do you consider to be the biggest challenge of the planning process? And that will depend probably on, you know, what kind of program you're working on. So the first option was achieving a viable project. That scored quite high, that was 32%.
Yeah.
The second option was achieving overall design quality. That scored much lower at 14%. The third option was coordinating the different disciplines and technical studies. That had the lowest score, so that was just 9%.
Yeah. And
by far the biggest challenge, which I think is really interesting for the planning process, our audience says, is resident and community consultation at 45% of our audience.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you. Well, I think in truth, all 4 of those challenges need to be addressed in your planning process. You can't have one without the other. You need a viable project. We haven't really focused, and we haven't had the time to focus on design quality, but actually design quality and buildability are so important. We want to contribute to the built environment in a positive way. Your role as a development manager is all about coordinating the different disciplines and technical studies and making sure it hangs together, keeping focus on that program, on your budget, on your cash flow, and the viability and the financial appraisal of the project. So your role is all about making sure that hangs together, working with your employer's agent and others. But it is absolutely true to say that resident community engagement and consultation is vital. So many of the projects will be infill schemes. So many will be on existing estates. So taking the community with you, persuading the benefits of your project and the mitigations against certain challenges and risks are so important. So thank you very much for that. That was really interesting and helpful. So I've now finished my presentation. If we had more time, goodness me, but we don't. But thank you very much, and thank you so much for listening. And I'm going to hand over to Visika now.
Okay, thank you, Danny. Thank you for taking us through this stage where we've got to planning, and it's really quite an intense period in the development management of bringing a scheme forward. So there's a lot packed in there, as you said, Danny. A lot more time could be spent on it. But thank you very much. Just a reminder that the Q&A function is open for questions. I can see a few coming in, and do tell us who you are and who you work for. And if you want to direct the question at a particular person, you can put that on as well. Obviously, you've only heard Danny so far, but we do have a wider panel, which I'll introduce to you in the second half. It's at this point, for our those of you watching the video version, that we will be stopping the recording. So thank you for watching our presentation on project Inception and planning, and we hope that you'll visit us on our website, which is on the Future of London YouTube, and you'll be able to see other events that we take and that you might want to get involved with. So to our video participants, please do stay in contact.